Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. And before going into my thoughts on this series, I want to go ahead and share about this series being comprised of 4 stories. This is a bind-up edition that I was very fortunate to receive from a good friend. Thank you, Evie. But unfortunately, this edition is no longer in print. And because of that, if you find it, you'll probably find it used and for a lot of money. Therefore, I would recommend going the omnibus edition route. So there are 2 omnibus editions. The first one is Shadow and Betrayal, and that includes the first 2 stories, A Shadow in Summer and A Betrayal in Winter. And the second omnibus, which is The Price of War, and that includes the last 2 stories, An Autumn War and The Price of Spring. Now on to my thoughts on this series, and I will keep this spoiler free, and I'm going to include timestamps down below. And towards the end, I'm going to talk at length about where I think this fits in the fantasy genre, exploring the subgenres of high fantasy and epic fantasy. Now, first, I'm going to talk about the themes. So, as you can imagine, with the words long and price in the title, we are exploring the consequence of choice. And because there are 15-year gaps between each of the stories in this bind up or in this series, we are dealing with a large span of time, and we see the consequence of choice over time. And so questions regarding these themes might include ones like, what is the price of love when there is grief and loss? What is the price of friendship if there is potential betrayal and mistrust? What is the price of abiding by tradition if it doesn't align with your personal values versus countering tradition at the cost of power? And maybe another question could be, what is the price of revealing the truth when the truth could destroy all versus stuffing down the truth and the shame eating you out alive? So I feel like the price question comes up quite a bit. You see the word price in the text quite a bit, but Abraham never tells you a moral answer to any of these questions. I think he leaves you to wonder whether certain choices are better than others and to explore just how nuanced and difficult some of the consequences are to each choice we make over time. I should also mention that patriarchy is explored in this story, and while not a central focus of this series, we do explore the woman's right to choose to have a child, not necessarily the right not to have a child, but the right to have a child. It's a very interesting exploration on that. And I'll also mention that I think renewal gets explored as well as we go on in this series. Now to talk about the setup of the story. So we start out this story in the Kayam Empire up in the mountains at a poet's school, and where we're introduced to our 2 primary characters throughout the series, Ota and Mati. More about them a little later, but they meet at a very young age at this school which trains young boys to be poets. These boys are estranged from their families, and they are brought up under rigorous training and discipline to learn the skill of binding what's called an ondat. An ondat is a magical thought form creature, and in order to bind an ondat, you have to have skills with grammar and logic. It's very, very difficult to do. And once these ondat forms are manifested, you never know exactly what they will do or how they will act. They seem to have a consciousness of their own, but they are also a reflection of the poet's psyche, the shadow aspect of the poet's psyche. And so that's another part that makes them very dangerous. And the interesting thing about the ondats, once they're manifested, is that they're bound to the poets for life, but their nature is always to want freedom or to aspire towards freedom. So it's a very complicated dynamic, the dynamic between the poet and the magic form, the ondat. Now, you might ask, what is this all about? Why would they do this to these poor little boys? Why would they train them to bring about this magic that represents their shadow aspect, that they're bound to for life? And you don't know what you get exactly with these Ondat creatures. And the reason why is because these Ondat magic creatures bring a lot of prosperity to the empire. So there's a huge gain for the empire to train these poets to have these ondats manifesting, but it is a very dangerous business. And we do get introduced to one of these ondats in book 1. I'll just go ahead and give that away. There's an ondat named Seedless. It's interesting because when I was describing the visual description to my husband, he right away said, "That sounds like No Face from Spirited Away." And I shared that with Alan from the Library of Alexandria, and Alan said the same thing. He said that in his first review. So I could definitely see that visual association with Seedless and No Face from Spirited Away. However, when I was reading A Shadow in Summer, I kept on thinking of the Shinigami from Death Note because there was something about Seedless that he was not only persuasive and cunning, but he also seemed to take this weird, gleeful fascination in character flaws. While the story starts out in that poet school up north in the mountains, the majority of book one actually takes place in a seaside city called Seriket. Seriket is the most prosperous in the Kayam Empire due to its trade industry with cotton, which is largely because of Seedless, the Ondat that is there that I already described. And it's there in that setting that I feel like you get a lot of the Japanese inspiration right away of this story. And when I say that, what I mean is that a lot of the characters wear robes, that's the main attire. They often meet in bathhouses where they have tea, and they eat cuisine such as rice and fish. So it felt to me very reminiscent of Japan in that way. And another setting that's explored throughout the series is the city of Machi, which is up north in the mountains. And that's where you have the Kai's palace with towers that soar up into the sky, underground tunnelways, and slaves singing in the streets. And you also have that cold atmosphere there, which contrasts the hot atmosphere in Sariket. And I feel like Abraham's prose really has these wonderful touches of atmosphere while not feeling heavy or dense. I would consider his prose quite accessible, but it still immerses you in another time and place. And speaking of time, I thought another detail that Abraham added was how he described time as hands, as half a hand or a hand. So it was a very interesting, unique feature, I think, to the world without being overly explained. And there are also poses. And so the characters will take on these certain poses or gestures to communicate certain ideas or thoughts or feelings. And the way Abraham does this, he does not describe what the gesture or pose looks like. He will explicitly state on the page, she took on a pose of apology, or he took on a pose of obeisance, or he took on a pose of inquiry. So he states bluntly what the poses are rather than describing what they look like. And I know that might be a little bit different, but I personally thought it added a lot to the culture, so I did not mind it. Now I want to talk about the characters, and I want to specifically focus on how characters age in this story because I thought this was such an interesting aspect of the Long Price Quartet. You do get young and old characters in each of the stories and really interesting dynamics between the two, but it was really interesting to see how they start out in book one and ways in which they retain a sense of self throughout the series while changing as well. So, with two primary characters, Ota and Mati, it was really interesting to see this. So, with Ota is a character who you see in book one, has an internal sense of what is right and wrong, and he renounces cruelty. He has a strong sense of will. At the same time, he also has a desire for freedom. And while these two things don't seem like they should be at odds with one another, you see how they come into conflict with one another over time as the story progresses. And then you have Mati, and Mati has a strong sense of loyalty and duty to the poet school, while also being very loyal over time to two other characters. And you see how that creates a lot of conflict for Mati in the story. But as these characters progress throughout the series, you see how these internal desires and conflicts, they change depending on the context, depending on their age and experience. And it's so fascinating to see how certain characters, as they grow older, either mature and age gracefully, or, especially with those who are more isolated, become more eccentric with age. And you also notice how complex friendship is. It's very complicated when you're young, becoming friends with people when you're young, but there are different challenges with friendships when you're older, too. And speaking also of this dynamic between friendships and relationships in general, I also found it particularly interesting how romantic relationships shift. You do see how romantic partnership is different in youth than it is in old age. And one thing I appreciated is that while we have both male and female characters aging, you see that women as they grow older, they're still considered beautiful by their male counterpart. And I really appreciated that because in a lot of fantasy stories, women are way over the hill past the age of 30. And in this story, you have women who are going into older age with their hair graying, becoming soft of body, maybe getting lines on their face and jowls, but still being considered attractive and sexually attractive to the male characters. And of course, the male characters are also described in detail as far as their aging characteristics. And I think it was just beautiful to see that dynamic and how that works over time, how it's different, but no less passionate, no less special. And speaking, by the way, of these relationships, I should go ahead and mention there is infidelity in this story, and it's not just the male characters. Just want to say that. And I did mention there is patriarchy in this world. And you see that in the poet school right at the beginning. Women are not allowed to be poets. And when it comes to the Kai, the emperor of the Kayam nation, the emperor is allowed many wives, and yet women are only allowed one husband, and women are expected to be servants to their husbands. So you see how the characters, especially the female characters, really struggle with some of this and how they are affected by things. And this also affects some of the choices they make. And this also ties into the larger political plot of the story. So, as for the plot, I'm going to go ahead and talk about that now. As I mentioned, the Kayam Empire is very Japanese inspired, but there's another empire which contrasts it called the Empire of Galt. And Galt sees the Kayam as a threat, especially with the Ondot system. They see this as a very big imbalance of power. And so they're always trying to bring down the Ondot magical system. And I have to admit that in book one, the way that this particular plot transpired, I thought it was really weird, honestly. I'm not saying it was bad. I'm just saying I thought it was weird. I had to reread a few pages a few times to wrap my head around it. After that, I thought that the plot was very smooth and it made sense. It was pretty straightforward, easy to follow. It was just that first book that threw my head through a loop a little bit. But overall, I think the overarching plot of this series was incredible because where we end up in book 4 just kept making me think about where we started in book 1. And I do think there's an overall arch to the story, to the series, maybe with an Autumn War, book 3 being the climax, because as you can imagine, with war in the title, there is war. But I do think there are some amazing climactic things that happen in book 4. The 15-year gaps that happen between each story was an interesting choice because Abraham doesn't take the time to give you every detail of what happens in those 15-year gaps. He gives you enough to wonder about and to make inferences, but for the most part, he begins each installment in the present moment of the timeline and naturally progresses the story forward. Overall, though, I thought that this series was very cohesive because it's very difficult to think about character work unless you think about the whole entire journey and the way that he uses time and season and theme in a cohesive way. So I thought it all worked together rather well. Now I'm going to talk about where this might fit in the fantasy genre. Now, I am intrigued by this question personally because as I was reading the story, as I was reading the series, again, I was just really inspired by the way Abraham zoomed in on the character details and the character experience to illustrate theme. And yet at the same time, as I was reading the story, I got to an Autumn War, and there is, as I mentioned, a large political plot happening. There is war, there's a lot at stake, including masses of people and future generations. At the same time, I still felt hesitant to call it epic fantasy. And so I wanted to explore, well, what does epic fantasy mean? And I know the word epic in our modern day and age refers to what is big, awesome, grandiose. And so this led me down a rabbit hole to re-examine what the word epic means. This takes me back to English class when I was in high school, and my teacher talked about what an epic is, and we read Beowulf, and she talked about how it's an epic poem, only years later to find out from Philip Chase that, well, actually, Beowulf is better understood as a Christian's lament for the past rather than an epic poem. But this did cause me to re-examine that term again. And I reviewed this one video that I thought was pretty concise about the topic. in which the person was saying that the word epic comes from the ancient Greek word epos or epos. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. Alan will know. But this particular word refers to word, narrative, song, and the earliest epic poems as we know them were orally passed down, and they usually involved heroes, deities, magic, lots of travel, but they were also foundational texts for a culture. They would usually talk about the most important ideals of a culture, of what we should aspire towards, or the ideas that we should rebel and reject. But there's also an association with epics being very long. And so I went ahead and read a couple of essays by Stephen Donaldson, and there was one in particular in which he says, an epic is not epic merely because it is longer than anything else. An epic is epic because it deals explicitly with the largest and most important questions of humankind. What is the meaning of life? Why are we here? What is the moral order of the universe? So on and so forth. And I thought this was interesting because with the Long Price Quartet, while I do think that the themes in the Long Price Quartet are ones that are very deep in the human experience, I don't know if they are the most important questions or quite to that level, but I don't know if Stevenson would make the distinction or not. I'm not sure. But I did find it interesting that he didn't think an epic was epic merely by length alone. I liked that line. And I also liked this other statement he said in the essay. It is interesting that throughout English literary history, no writer has been able to write an enduring epic without using the metaphor of magic and the techniques of personification. Apparently, to be epic, a work must not only be long and profound, it must almost be fantasy. And I thought this was interesting because, as I mentioned with the Long Price Quartet, the Ondat are representative of a shadow aspect of the poet, and they are directly having to confront their own shadow of their psyche. I thought it was interesting to think of magic as metaphor and dealing with the human psyche and human experience in that way in this series. And there are other ways, certainly, in which characters are confronting darker truths outside of just the Ondat. But I just found it interesting to read that quote and think about that aspect of the Long Price Quartet. And then I also watched a video by Jay from Captured in Words, in which he defines the various subgenres in fantasy. He talks about the distinction between low fantasy and high fantasy, which is a separate argument or discussion, and I thought it was really interesting the way he described it. But he also talked about the distinction between high fantasy and epic fantasy. And in his video, he basically says that in high fantasy, we are in a secondary world, perhaps with its own flora and fauna and magic, maybe magical creatures, maybe magical races. But a high fantasy story is really focused on one character, on the hero's journey. And I imagine that he's implying that the themes in high fantasy would be ones that are very personal to that one character. So maybe love, loyalty, betrayal, just to give a few examples. Whereas in an epic fantasy story, according to Jay, we are encompassing a larger span of settings, so a greater world. And so there's more expansion there. And it has to be multi-POV. He said that you cannot have epic fantasy with single POV. You have to have multiple perspectives in order for it to be epic. Based on that definition, though, I'm also assuming that with epic fantasy, we're dealing with broader themes that maybe apply to a wider span of people, such as societal themes or colonialism, justice. Does the end justify the means, or do we sacrifice the few for the many? So I'm going to imagine that's more aligned with epic fantasy to explore those broader questions. And this leads me to question, where does the Long Price Quartet fit in this continuum on the spectrum? Because I think Jay would agree that that high fantasy and epic fantasy, that there's going to be crossover with any subgenre. But I would put this more in the high fantasy category based on his definition. There is war, so there are higher political stakes. There are multiple perspectives. However, I still think that the settings are fairly contained book per book. And even though there are a few perspectives, I still feel like we're zoomed in, especially on the friendship between two characters and the very personal experiences of characters. We're just very zoomed in to an intimate exploration of theme. And so for that reason, I think it would be more high fantasy. And I also appreciate Stephen Donaldson's idea about magic as metaphor and how that's representative through the Ondot system and the shadow aspect of the psyche with Ondot. And I think this could be important for most readers because while we do have some epic elements, I think some readers might be disappointed if they're expecting epic fantasy to be this expansive world building and this expansive exploration of big epic themes, only to find that this is a very intimate, zoomed in character study. So I think that that would be helpful for people going into the story to know that. And I feel like I did have the right expectations of that based on friends of mine who've read the series and who've talked about it. So, including Alan from the Library of Alexandria. I think he set me up pretty well to understand that this was going to be very zoomed in on the characters and that it would take its time building up to something important as far as what it had to say about characters and their experiences over time. Just for some final closing thoughts, it's interesting because where I'm at right now, I think book one might be my favorite. And I know that sounds weird because I already said that I thought the plot in book one was a little weird earlier in this video, but I still think it was my favorite because I just really loved the introduction to the world. I felt a personal connection with the Sarikhet setting. It made me want to travel. I don't know, there was something about it that just kept coming up in my thoughts as I read on too. Again, I thought it was beautiful the way the story unfolded. I thought each of the books, each of the installments was excellent. And I loved the way that the story, that the overall series ended, once again, bringing back so much from book one. So it was a beautiful journey, in my opinion. I enjoyed it quite a bit. But I would love to hear from others who have read the series, what you thought, and if you would consider this more high fantasy or epic fantasy, or if you think it probably doesn't matter at all. Either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. And if you haven't read the series, I would love to hear your thoughts on this video, of course. And if you just want to say hi and let me know you're here, please say hi. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.